to a degree that we don't. I realize I'm preaching to the choir. I'm very glad to have a chance to talk to you, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks. Can you speak a little bit to the right of return, or the Palestinian argument about that kind of international law?
Sure. Okay, so the right of return has to do with the basic question. It's a loaded term at both levels. One of the ideas that's concrete in the Israeli Declaration of Independence and all Israeli policy since then is a Jewish idea of return. The idea that one of the reasons you have a state of Israel is that Jews need a place to go in times of trouble. It's one of the justifications for Zionism. Seems pretty good. So Jews have a right to apply for and generally receive citizenship in Israel. It's called the right of return. Now, the Palestinian right of return sort of turns that on its head. It wants to know when Palestinian refugees, or maybe their kids and grandkids, can go back to the land that had been taken from them in what is now the state of Israel. Two observations. One, obviously, this hangs on exactly what we're talking about. If there is a history that shows that this house belongs to my father, this key that I carry around my neck that he gave to me fits that lock, and that I was driven from that land by Israeli forces in 1948, I have a claim to that land. If, on the other hand, I left that land voluntarily, I have much less of a claim. One of the sticking points in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations today has to do with the Palestinian right of return. Everyone agrees that thousands and thousands of people were driven from their land, that unjust and bad things were done. No one really argues about that. Now, the question is, how do you make recompacts with that? Do we offer a right of return to refugees or their children or grandchildren to go back into the state of Israel? If we do, and we wake up tomorrow and there are 600,000 more Arabs in the state of Israel, that is a much less Jewish state than it was before. And so from the Israeli perspective, the character of Israel is a question here, which indeed it is. I mean, it really is a sticky question, but you can see that, like everything else, it hangs on some analysis or knowledge or interpretation of Israel.
Because most people want a two-state solution, how do they solve the problem of Jerusalem? Because
Okay, so a two-state solution, that there ought to be a state of Israel and a state of Palestine next to it that's independent, but we're not at war with one another. This is the solution that most people point to. This is one of the other sticking points. The right of return is an important sticking point. The settlers, a hugely important sticking point. And then the condition of the state of the city of Jerusalem. This is particularly critical because Jerusalem is on the dividing line between those two states. From 48 to 67, in fact, it was divided. East Jerusalem was Arab, administered by the Jordanians at that point. West Jerusalem was Jewish, Israeli. After 1967 and the unification of Jerusalem under Israeli rule, Israel declared Jerusalem its capital. A declaration that has not been recognized by any other country, including the United States, because the Palestinians claim Jerusalem as their capital too. This is trouble. So now what do? There are all kinds of arguments. We could redivide it. That's not great. We could declare it an open city with joint administration, I guess. But again, if this were easy, it would have been done a long time ago. There are all kinds of different possibilities about how to handle Jerusalem, all of them guaranteed to be completely unacceptable to one side or the other. So. Absolutely. Okay. So, there's no chocolate. Yeah, here's some chocolate. So, in the West Bank, now, oh gosh, I gotta draw a map. That's not good. This is Israel. Here's the Gaza Strip, right? Here's the West Bank. Okay. The problem is that elections were held in the Palestinian territories 8 years ago now, 9 years ago, that were won by Fatah, which is the predominant organization within the umbrella organization that is the Palestine Liberation Organization. Okay? Fatah has generally been the most important, the largest, and the most moderate, especially since the death of Yasser Arafat. Fatah, under the leadership of its new leader, Mahmoud Abbas, has been much more conciliatory toward Israel, has been working toward a negotiated solution, has recognized the state of Israel in the Oslo Accords. Now, Fatah and Abbas won an election for president, but then an election several years later for parliament, they lost. They lost the parliamentary majority to Hamas. Hamas, none of the things I said about Fatah, okay? Not recognizing the state of Israel, explicitly Islamist, dedicated to the armed struggle. So, in practice, what this has meant is that Hamas, on the claim of its having won parliamentary elections, said, we have the right to form a government. Mahmoud Abbas said, yeah, democracy is cute and all, but I don't think so. In practice, what this has meant is that Hamas was able to take over the government of the Gaza through violent means, while Fatah has been in charge in the much larger West Bank. Over the past several years, it's been night and day between those two territories. The West Bank has developed in every good way. The infrastructure is better, the politics are better, governance is cleaner, they're much closer to peace with Israel. Abbas comes to the United States, is treated like a head of state, everything's fine. Hamas, again, none of those things, right? Increasing, grinding poverty, a police state, a theocratic police state in Hamas, the most sort of awful and cartoonish anti-Semitism in their rhetoric toward the state of Israel. And this, of course, culminates a couple of years ago with an Israeli reinvasion of a Hamas that they had largely deoccupied. Operation Cast Lead, leading to many deaths among Gaza civilians and charges of war crimes against Israeli soldiers. It's just bad. And Hamas and Fatah have been more or less in a cold civil war for the past several years, until about a month ago. Under the auspices of other Arab leaders, Hamas and Fatah have sat down very recently and declared a government of national unity. Now, the problem here is that Abbas knows he can't make a long-term peace deal as long as he can't control all Palestinian territory and as long as he is in a de facto civil war with the other main political component of Palestinian life. Abbas knows he can't conclude a real peace deal under those circumstances, except that he has also been told by Israel that if he makes peace with Hamas, he can't make peace with Israel, because Hamas is still dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel. This is a rock and a hard place. Abbas has come to the conclusion that negotiating with the Netanyahu government is no good. He's just not going to get anywhere. And so he has decided to make peace with Hamas, set up a government of national unity in all the Palestinian territories, and continue to play the card that they have been playing for about the past year, the card of an independent plea to the United Nations for Palestinian nationhood. Palestinians have bagged the peace process with the Israelis. They've given it up as a bad job. They are now doing the international diplomatic route of trying to convince every other country, ultimately in the Security Council or in the General Assembly of the United Nations, the Palestinian is and ought to be recognized as a nation. Yes?
How would you answer the question, how would you respond historically, politically, any kind of way, to people saying that all Palestinians are in agreement to Hamas and they are all terrorists because of Hamas?
All right. Well, it's manifestly not true, right? The majority of Palestinian Palestinians don't live in Gaza in the first place. They live in the West Bank. The kernel of truth there is that Hamas did win a parliamentary majority in the last free election. I mean, you can't wish that away. That happened. You can explain it some. You can explain to people that the larger PLO, and Fatah especially, was famously corrupt at the time of those elections. You can argue that Hamas had set itself up, just as Hezbollah has in Lebanon, as much as a social war. Palestinians are beholden to Hamas, or that Palestine is a terrorist entity. I mean, why don't you just say that Germany is a Nazi entity, right? Why don't you blame every German for the Holocaust? That would be a horrible, racist, inappropriate thing to do. It would paint with a ridiculously broad brush with no sense of nuance to make a crass political point. That would not be cool. Frank?
Yes, Hamas has made the offer, and I'd like your opinion on how genuine it was, a number of times to have a 10-year ceasefire and that they would recognize Israel in the pre-67 lines, which many people feel is, if there's going to be an agreement, it'll have to be that. Do you see Hamas as perhaps split a little bit? They've got their various wings.
But Hamas now looks a little bit like Fatah in the early 90s, in that there's a huge political division between a political leadership that has largely been expatriated. The vast majority of Hamas leaders don't live in Gaza. They live in Damascus, or they live in Beirut, or they live someplace else. The same thing was true of Fatah and the PLO in the early 90s. Yasser Arafat had spent the previous 20 years in Amman and Beirut and Tunis. He had no real connection. The people who are actually living real life down here, who are becoming increasingly less devoted to sticking it in the thumb of the abstract notion of an Israeli state and would just like it if their garbage ever got picked up, or to put a finer point on it, if they weren't living under armed siege. So yeah, there absolutely is a division in Hamas between mostly younger, more pragmatic people on the ground in Gaza, and a political leadership and religious leadership, it is a theocratic movement, that's still largely out of the country and still largely devoted to these abstract notions, including the destruction of the state of Israel. How that goes, I mean, we know what happened in Fatah, right? Fatah under Abbas did make that generational shift. Whether it will happen with Hamas, it's impossible to say. Harrison?
We've already seen rippling effects that occurred in Egypt when the Arab Spring or Arab movement started. Do you potentially see that could give Hamas an expanding role into Israel potentially?
The Israeli government was not enthusiastic about the Arab Spring for some practical reasons. They looked at Egypt and they saw a Mubarak regime that had kept anti-Israeli enthusiasm in the population down for the past 20 years, that had enforced the Camp David agreements at the expense of popular opinion. And I mean, let's not be flippant about this. This is exactly what got Anwar Sadat killed, was signing the Camp David agreement. It was never popular. So Israel has been sort of the odd man out about this Arab Spring thing. I'm not sure. But how does this relate to Hamas? Within Israel, there's been kind of a miniature Arab Spring. There have been massive street protests, mostly by younger, to some degree leftists, but not exclusively, Israelis demanding a change in the political system. There has yet to be a Palestinian Spring, though. In the sense of Palestinians rebelling against their political authority, to this point, politics and people are sufficiently united in Palestine that the closest thing you've had to it is jointly sponsored civil disobedience actions in Palestine. Now, if those continue, I would argue that that ultimately strengthens the hand of Fatah, which has recently embraced the civil disobedience argument, saying that that's how we get out of this. If the Palestinian people generally buy into that way of achieving their political aims,